In the hush of a midnight long past, the world seemed to hold its breath. The year was 1947, and though the guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, a different kind of tension now drifted through the air, quieter, colder, and far more patient. It was not the roar of bombs that unsettled hearts, but the steady, invisible chill of mistrust. Cities lay in quiet slumber, their streets still marked by the scars of war. Buildings wore the tired faces of survivors, bricks patched hastily, windows replaced with mismatched glass. In the glow of dim street lamps, life carried on, milk delivered at dawn, markets opening with the scent of fresh bread, children's laughter echoing briefly before being hushed by parents who sensed, though could not explain, that the peace was fragile. Across oceans, leaders spoke in measured tones, their words heavy with double meanings. Newspapers carried headlines about alliances, pacts, and speeches delivered in solemn halls. To some, it was politics as usual. To others, it was the beginning of an age where battles would be fought not in open fields, but in the shadows, with whispers, letters, and coded messages. The United States and the Soviet Union, once reluctant allies, now stood apart like two great mountains divided by an unseen valley. Each claimed to defend freedom, each believed the other sought control. Between them stretched an expanse of ideology and pride, so wide that no bridge seemed sturdy enough to cross. In the stillness of an early morning in Berlin, soldiers in different uniforms walked the same streets, their boots clicking on the cobblestones. One soldier glanced across to another, offering neither smile nor scowl, just the brief acknowledgement of someone who understood that their presence was not about friendship, but about holding a line. It was in this climate that the Cold War began, without a single gunshot to mark its start. No trumpet sounded. No flag was raised. Instead, it seeped quietly into the fabric of daily life, like frost appearing overnight on a windowpane. People adapted, as people always do. Families in America stocked pantries with canned goods, just in case. In the Soviet Union, conversations at kitchen tables became hushed when certain topics arose. Children learned to read maps not for adventure, but to understand where danger might one day come from. And somewhere, in the depths of government buildings, men and women tapped on typewriters, filing reports that might change the course of history, though they themselves would remain nameless. The Cold War was not a season of constant fear, but rather a long, lingering awareness, a presence in the background. Like a low note in a song, it was always there, even if you weren't listening for it. It shaped decisions, dreams, and even the way strangers met eyes in a crowd. And yet, amid the caution and careful steps, life carried on. Couples still met and married, songs still played on radios, and the moon still rose above the world's uncertain landscape, casting silver light on both East and West alike. This was the world at the dawn of the Cold War, not a battlefield, but a chessboard. Not a blaze, but a slow, cold wind. And as the first moves were made, history itself leaned in, ready to watch a game that would last for decades. The war had ended, but Europe was far from healed. Its cities bore the tired look of survivors, some with missing teeth in the form of empty building lots, others with deep wrinkles of bomb damage yet to be smoothed away. Railways ran again, but slowly, as though the trains themselves were unsure if it was safe to trust the peace. In the early years after 1945, the continent became something of a puzzle, with pieces that no longer fit as they once had. Old alliances had dissolved, new ones were forming, and in between were millions of people simply trying to find a way back to normal life. Yet, normal was an elusive thing. The old world was gone, and a new one was being drawn in invisible ink. Berlin, at the heart of it all, was no longer one city but four, carved into sectors controlled by the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets. At first, there was a polite exchange of necessities, food, coal, medical supplies. But beneath the handshakes and formal agreements, mistrust ran deep. Each side looked at the other with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, like neighbors who smile at the fence but keep their doors locked. For ordinary Berliners, life became a balancing act. The streets might look familiar, but the rules were changing. A tram ride could take you from one zone to another, where the language on the signs was different, the uniforms carried another badge, and the newspapers told a slightly different version of the truth. In cafes, conversations were guarded. People spoke in low voices, not knowing who might be listening. Across the rest of Europe, the same quiet division was taking shape. In the West, American aid began to flow through the Marshall Plan, bringing hope in the form of rebuilding projects and supplies. In the East, under Soviet influence, factories and farmlands were reorganized according to Moscow's plans. What one side called liberation, the other called control. The divide was not just political, it was cultural, personal. A child in France might grow up with American jazz on the radio, while a child in Poland learned songs praising the workers of the collective farm. A young man in Italy might dream of working in a bustling city like New York, while a young woman in Czechoslovakia was encouraged to build her future in service to the state. And yet, on warm summer evenings, the air across Europe carried the same sense, the sweetness of bread cooling on windowsills, the faint smoke of wood-burning stoves, the fragrance of flowers that cared nothing for ideology. In these moments, the division felt less like a wall and more like a shadow, something that dimmed the light but could not erase it entirely. Still, those shadows were growing longer. In speeches and secret meetings, leaders on both sides were deciding the shape of the years to come. They were building not only armies, but stories about the enemy, stories that would settle into the hearts of their people and stay there for decades. The chessboard of the Cold War was nearly set. Pieces were being placed, lines were being drawn, and the quiet hum of tension was becoming part of the background music of daily life. For most people, the game was invisible. But for those paying close attention, it was clear, the world was entering a new kind of struggle, one without a clear beginning or end. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of typewriter keys tapped out the first chapters of a history still unfolding. The year was 1948, and the air in Europe seemed heavier than before. It was not the weight of war this time, but of decisions, choices being made in quiet offices that would soon shape the lives of millions. The city of Berlin, already divided in spirit, now found itself on the front line of a new kind of conflict. The Soviets, determined to secure their influence in the eastern sector, began to tighten their control. Checkpoints became stricter. Roads and railways leading into the western zones faced more frequent delays. It was a polite word for obstruction, but everyone understood the meaning. In June, the tension took a bold step forward. The Soviet Union closed all land routes into West Berlin, cutting off food, coal, and supplies to the more than 2 million people living there. The city, already scarred by war, was now an island, surrounded by hostility, isolated in a sea of uncertainty. The West could have abandoned Berlin, writing it off as an unfortunate casualty of geopolitics. But instead, a different choice was made. American and British forces began what would become one of the most remarkable humanitarian efforts of the century, the Berlin Airlift. Day and night, the skies above the city filled with the drone of aircraft. C-47s and C-54s, their bellies loaded with sacks of flour, crates of canned meat, and bundles of coal, descended onto Tempelhof and Gatow airfields with steady precision. To Berliners below, the sound of engines became the sound of hope. Children would gather at the edges of the runways, eyes wide as the planes touched down. Some pilots, moved by the faces looking up at them, began dropping small packages of sweets tied to handkerchief parachutes. To the little ones, these were not just candies, they were messages from the outside world, proof that someone, somewhere, cared. The airlift lasted for nearly a year, with thousands of flights bringing life into the city. Pilots braved fog, storms, and ice-slicked runways, guided only by dim lights and the will to keep Berlin alive. And slowly, the blockade began to lose its grip. In May 1949, the Soviets lifted it, conceding a rare symbolic victory to the West. But if the blockade had ended, the Cold War had only just begun. The lines had been drawn more clearly now. West Berlin stood as a small, stubborn island of freedom inside the vast expanse of the Eastern Bloc. The message was clear: neither side would give up easily, and neither would trust the other. Beyond Berlin, the ripples spread. Alliances hardened. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed, binding the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations into a military pact. In the East, plans were already forming for an opposing alliance, though it would take a few more years to emerge. For the people living through it, the world felt less certain. Yet, life continued its quiet rhythm. In the evenings, lights still glowed in kitchen windows, tea still steamed in cups, and the hum of radios filled small rooms with music. But beneath it all was a new awareness, that history was shifting under their feet, and no one could yet see where it would lead. The Cold War had found its first true confrontation, not in battlefields, but in the air above a divided city. And somewhere, high above Berlin, a lone cargo plane banked gently toward the runway, carrying both supplies and the fragile hope of a world still learning how to live with its own divisions. The summer of 1949 brought with it a quiet but undeniable shift. The Berlin airlift had ended, yet the sky above Europe still seemed to hum with invisible currents of tension. The relief of victory for West Berlin faded into the awareness that the continent was now split more deeply than before. It was Winston Churchill who, years earlier, had spoken of an Iron Curtain stretching across Europe. At first, it had been just a phrase, a metaphor in a speech. But now, the image felt real. On one side, nations rebuilt with the help of the Marshall Plan, embracing markets, elections, and Western culture. On the other, countries under Soviet influence followed a different path, where the press was controlled, dissent was unwelcome, and political loyalty was expected. The curtain did not clang shut like a door. It descended slowly, in small, deliberate steps. Borders became less porous, guards appeared at crossings, and travel that had once been a matter of buying a train ticket now required official permission. In some towns, families found themselves split overnight, one half in the west, the other in the east, separated by a line on a map. In the kitchens of Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest, life continued under watchful eyes. Radio broadcasts were monitored, and certain foreign stations were jammed with static. Neighbors were careful with their words, unsure who might repeat them to the authorities. In schools, children learned songs praising their leaders, reciting slogans that would stay with them into adulthood. Meanwhile, in the West, a different rhythm played. American jazz clubs thrived in Paris. Italian cinemas lit up with romantic films. London's newspapers debated politics with a freedom that Eastern Europe could only imagine. But even here, the Cold War seeped into daily life. Military service was strengthened, civil defense drills became routine, and the idea of the enemy shaped both policy and imagination. In this divided world, espionage began to blossom. The streets of Vienna, with their tangled alleyways, became a playground for spies. So did Berlin, where agents from both sides shadowed one another across cafes and street markets. Briefcases changed hands, coded notes were left in hollowed-out books, and cameras no bigger than a matchbox captured the secrets of the other side. Yet for all the whispers and watchfulness, most people were not spies or soldiers. They were farmers tending fields, mothers raising children, students dreaming of the future. They lived with the awareness of tension, but they also lived, baking bread, celebrating birthdays, and walking hand in hand under the same stars that shone over both East and West. The Iron Curtain was more than a line on a map. It was a mindset, a way of seeing the world as us and them, of assuming that what lay beyond was dangerous, even unknowable. And in the quiet moments, when the streets were still and the radios silent, that curtain felt heavier, as if it could block not just people, but hope itself. But curtains can be lifted, if only briefly, and across the coming decades there would be moments when light pierced through. For now, though, the fabric of division hung thick, and the stage of the Cold War was set for acts still to come. The dawn of the 1950s brought with it a new kind of unease, one that could not be seen, heard, or touched, yet seemed to hang over the entire world. It was the shadow of the atom, the quiet knowledge that humanity had created a force capable of ending everything in an instant. The memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was still fresh, lingering in newspapers, in whispered conversations, and in the nightmares of those who had seen the destruction firsthand. But now, that memory was not confined to one nation's arsenal. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, and suddenly the balance of power shifted. No longer was there one wielder of this terrible weapon, there were two. In Washington and Moscow, military planners spoke in calm, deliberate tones, drawing diagrams and calculating distances. Behind those closed doors, they imagined scenarios too devastating to speak of in public. The term mutual assured destruction had not yet entered everyday language, but the idea was already taking root, that if either side pressed the button, both would perish. In schoolrooms across America, children were taught to duck and cover beneath their desks, as if the thin wood might shield them from the sun-bright fire of an atomic blast. Sirens were tested monthly, their wailing cries slicing through the morning air. Families built small shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods and water, as though preparing for a storm that might last forever. Across the ocean, in Soviet towns and cities, similar precautions took shape. Civil defense drills were conducted with the same measured seriousness. Citizens learned where to find the nearest underground shelter, though in their hearts they knew that safety, in the face of such a weapon, was an illusion. And yet, life went on. The world, remarkably, did not grind to a halt under the weight of this knowledge. In the evenings, lights still glimmered in apartment windows. Theaters still opened their doors. Markets still filled with the hum of voices. But beneath the daily noise, there was a faint, steady hum of awareness, that at any moment, the sky could change. The arms race had begun, though few at the time fully understood the pace it would take. Factories worked around the clock to produce not only more bombs, but bigger, more powerful ones. Scientists on both sides of the curtain pushed the limits of technology, chasing the illusion that greater strength would somehow bring greater safety. It was a strange paradox of the Cold War: the more destructive the weapons became, the less likely leaders were to use them. The fear of the atom was, in its own way, a restraint, a grim promise that neither side could afford to break. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world slept, the weapons slept too, locked away in silos, hidden beneath the waves in submarines, waiting in silent readiness. And somewhere in those still moments, perhaps a soldier standing watch looked up at the same moon that hung over his supposed enemy, and wondered if the people on the other side were just as afraid. The Cold War was not always loud. Sometimes it was this, a calm surface with deep currents beneath. A tension that made the smallest details of life, a child's laughter, a quiet dinner, the first bloom of spring, feel all the more precious. By the early 1950s, the Cold War was no longer just a contest of armies or weapons, it had become a war of secrets. The front lines were not trenches or battlefields, but back alleys, hotel rooms, and park benches where briefcases changed hands under the cover of night. In London, Washington, and Moscow, intelligence agencies grew in size and ambition. The CIA and the KGB became two of the most whispered names in the world, each determined to outthink and outmaneuver the other. Theirs was a game of patience, precision, and deception, played in whispers rather than shouts. Espionage was not always glamorous. More often, it was quiet, methodical, and lonely. A spy might spend years cultivating a single contact, gathering fragments of information so small they seemed meaningless, until combined with other fragments to form a picture of great importance. Berlin, with its split heart, became the crown jewel of intelligence work. Here, agents could cross from east to west in a matter of minutes, slipping through sectors under the watchful eyes of soldiers. Safe houses were tucked away behind ordinary facades, a bakery, a bookshop, a second-floor apartment with peeling wallpaper and a single telephone. In Vienna, the streets told their own stories. A man sitting at a cafe table reading the newspaper might be watching the entrance to a nearby building. A woman feeding pigeons might be waiting for a signal, a dropped glove, a folded piece of paper left beneath a bench. Codes were hidden in letters, in radio broadcasts, in the subtle patterns of lights flashing from one window to another. Every agent lived with the quiet knowledge that a single mistake could mean exposure. In the East, arrest might lead to interrogation in dim, windowless rooms. In the West, betrayal could mean being spirited away in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. And yet, for all the risks, the work continued. Some spies believed they were serving a higher cause, protecting their country from a looming threat. Others were motivated by money, or by grudges, or simply by the thrill of the game. In the shadows, ideals and intentions blurred. A double agent could pass information to one side in the morning and to the other in the evening, living in a constant state of delicate balance. There were victories, though they often went unseen. A stolen document that prevented a diplomatic disaster. A decoded message that revealed the location of a weapons test. Each success was a quiet thread in the vast tapestry of the Cold War, threads that, if pulled, might have unraveled history as we know it. But the most remarkable thing about this world of whispers was how ordinary it could appear to anyone not looking closely. The spy might be the man who sold you your morning bread, or the woman who taught your child's music lessons. The face of espionage was not always stern or mysterious, sometimes it smiled, asked about your family, and passed you on the street without a second glance. As the Cold War deepened, so did the networks of shadows. They would stretch across continents, across oceans, and into the very heart of political power. And all the while, ordinary people went about their days, unaware that the person sitting beside them on the train might be carrying a secret capable of changing the fate of nations. The Korean Peninsula, a slender stretch of land between China and Japan, had long been a place where larger powers cast their gaze. But in the summer of 1950, it became something else entirely, the first battlefield of the Cold War. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel after World War II, a line drawn with political precision but little regard for the shared history of its people. To the north, a Soviet-backed government under Kim Il-sung promised unity under socialism. To the south, an American-supported administration under Syngman Rhee pledged freedom and democracy. Both sides claimed to be the rightful ruler of all Korea. The war began in June, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a swift and fierce advance. The attack was sudden but not entirely unexpected, tension had been simmering for months. Still, when the first shells fell, it felt as if the Cold War's quiet shadow had burst into flame. In the early weeks, the North's momentum was overwhelming. Town after town fell, and by August, the South's defenders were pressed into a small corner near Pusan. It seemed the entire peninsula might be swallowed whole. But the United Nations, led by American forces, intervened. Troops landed at Incheon in a daring amphibious assault, pushing the North Koreans back in a reversal so dramatic it seemed almost unreal. For a moment, victory seemed within reach. But just as swiftly as the tide had turned, it shifted again. Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River, joining the fight in waves that rolled southward with relentless determination. Winter descended on Korea, bringing with it bitter cold and a frozen stalemate. The fighting was fierce, but it was also deeply personal. Villages were split, families scattered, and the once shared culture of North and South became a casualty of the conflict. Soldiers huddled in trenches during icy nights, staring at the same stars that had once shone over a united land, wondering if they would ever see peace again. By 1953, the war ended not with victory, but with an armistice, a pause in the fighting, not a true peace. The 38th parallel remained, now reinforced by barbed wire, guard towers, and the ever-watchful eyes of soldiers on both sides. The Korean War was a reminder to the world that the Cold War was not always cold. It could flare into open combat, leaving behind scars that would last for generations. And though the guns fell silent, the division of Korea became one of the most enduring symbols of the era, a place where the invisible line between East and West was etched into the earth itself. Far away, in the quiet living rooms of America, Europe, and the Soviet Union, people read about the war in newspapers and listened to radio reports. For them, it was another chapter in the unfolding story of a divided world. But for Koreans, it was the day their homeland became two countries, a division that, decades later, still lingers like an unhealed wound. The Cold War was not fought only with armies or weapons. It was also fought in the realm of ideas, a quieter, yet equally determined struggle for the loyalty and belief of millions. In the United States, newspapers carried headlines warning of communist expansion. Magazines ran stories about life behind the Iron Curtain, often illustrated with stark photographs of bread lines, uniformed soldiers, and gray apartment blocks. Hollywood joined the effort, producing films where the villain was often a shadowy agent from the East, plotting in dimly lit rooms. Across the ocean, in the Soviet Union, the story was told differently. Films and posters showed workers standing proudly in factories, farmers in golden fields, and soldiers protecting the homeland from the dangers of capitalist greed. The West was portrayed as a land of poverty and exploitation, where the wealthy few ruled over the suffering many. Posters were everywhere, on factory walls, in schools, on the sides of buildings. They were painted in bold colors, often with a smiling worker holding a hammer or a soldier marching under a bright red flag. In America, posters carried slogans about freedom, democracy, and the dangers of communism, often with an eagle or the stars and stripes waving proudly in the background. Radio became one of the most powerful tools in this war of persuasion. The Voice of America broadcast music, news, and commentary into Eastern Europe, offering a window into the Western world. In return, Radio Moscow sent its own signals westward, speaking of peace, progress, and the flaws of capitalist societies. In many countries, people tuned in secretly, sometimes late at night, their radios turned low so that neighbors would not hear. Even the smallest details could carry meaning. A photograph of a smiling family in a well-furnished American home might be printed in a magazine for readers in the East, a quiet suggestion of the prosperity that democracy could bring. Meanwhile, images of Soviet space triumphs or vast harvests were shown in the West as proof that communism was strong and advancing. Schools, too, played their part. In America, children learned about the blessings of freedom and the dangers of dictatorship. In the Soviet Union, students studied the evils of imperialism and the heroism of socialist workers. The textbooks, the classroom posters, even the songs sung at school assemblies, all were part of the same silent campaign. It was a war without gunfire, but it was still a war. The goal was to shape how people saw the world, to make them believe, not just in their own system, but in the weakness of the other. And for many, these stories became the truth they lived by, passed down from one generation to the next. Yet beneath all the slogans and speeches, ordinary people on both sides still shared many of the same dreams: a safe home, good food on the table, a future for their children. They did not always believe everything they were told, but in a time when information was carefully controlled, it was hard to know what was real and what was simply the work of skilled propaganda. In this way, the Cold War crept into daily life, not as an open battle, but as a constant whisper, a reminder that the other side was always watching, always speaking, always trying to win not just the world, but the mind of the person listening. Old War had many frontiers, land, sea, air, but in the late 1950s, a new frontier emerged, one that stretched far beyond the clouds. It was a place no nation had yet claimed, and yet both the United States and the Soviet Union were determined to plant their flag there. The race for space had begun. It started quietly, with research, experiments, and speculation. Engineers and scientists in both nations were building rockets, first for military purposes, then for exploration. But when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 in October 1957, the world changed overnight. The little metal sphere was no larger than a beach ball, but its beeping signal, sent back to Earth as it circled overhead, was heard around the globe. In the West, people stepped outside at night, craning their necks to glimpse it moving across the stars. For some, it was a marvel. For others, it was a warning, proof that the Soviets could send objects, and perhaps weapons, into space. The United States responded quickly. In 1958, Explorer 1 was launched, carrying scientific instruments to measure cosmic radiation. It was a small victory, but the race was far from over. In April 1961, the Soviets struck again, sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit aboard Vostok 1. His single, sweeping journey around the Earth made him a hero not just in the Soviet Union, but in the eyes of the world. President John F. Kennedy, speaking to Congress, set a bold challenge: to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. It was an audacious goal, one that demanded new technology, new ideas, and a vast commitment of resources. NASA expanded rapidly, launching missions that tested the limits of human endurance and mechanical precision. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers pressed forward with their own plans. They launched the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and sent probes to explore the moon's surface. Every success was celebrated with parades and posters, every failure hidden from public view. The space race was not just about science. It was about proving the superiority of one system over another. A rocket launch was more than a technical achievement, it was a message to the world: we are strong. We are capable. We lead the future. Yet for all its political undertones, the race also inspired awe. Children on both sides of the Iron Curtain cut out newspaper clippings of astronauts and cosmonauts. Teachers spoke of the mysteries of space. Ordinary people, whether in Moscow, New York, or a small town far from either, could look up at the night sky and imagine themselves among the stars. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July 1969, the United States achieved Kennedy's goal. Neil Armstrong's first steps were broadcast across the globe, a moment of human triumph that transcended the rivalry that had fueled it. Still, the competition never fully faded. Even as astronauts shook hands in space years later, the memory of that intense race remained, a reminder that even in a time of division, the human spirit could reach for something greater. And so, the space race left its mark not just on technology or politics, but on the imagination itself. It turned the distant moon into a place we could touch, and in doing so, it made the stars feel just a little closer. In the autumn of 1962, the Cold War's quiet tension suddenly tightened into something sharper, something that felt like it could snap at any moment. The world held its breath for 13 days, the length of a crisis that brought humanity closer to nuclear war than ever before. It began with photographs. American U-2 spy planes, flying high above the Caribbean, captured images of long, narrow shapes hidden beneath camouflage netting in Cuba. To the trained eyes of analysts, there was no doubt, they were Soviet nuclear missiles, capable of striking cities across the United States in minutes. For President John F. Kennedy, it was an alarming discovery. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, it was a calculated move, a way to counter the American missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, aimed at the Soviet Union. For the people of Cuba, it was another turn in the turbulent relationship between Havana and Washington, one that had already been tested by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion the year before. Kennedy chose a word that sounded less like aggression and more like defense: quarantine. American ships formed a naval blockade around Cuba, stopping and inspecting Soviet vessels that might be carrying additional weapons. The move was bold but dangerous, a single miscalculation could turn the standoff into open war. Day by day, the tension deepened. In Washington, meetings stretched late into the night. In Moscow, Khrushchev weighed his options, sending letters to Kennedy, some cautious and conciliatory, others more confrontational. On both sides, military forces were placed on high alert. Bombers sat ready on runways, submarines patrolled the seas, and missiles waited in their silos. Around the world, ordinary people lived in a haze of anxiety. Some built or stocked bomb shelters. Others listened to the news every hour, wondering if the next bulletin would announce that war had begun. The idea of total destruction, once abstract, now felt close enough to touch. And then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the crisis began to ease. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public American promise not to invade the island, and a quiet, secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The ships turned around, the missiles were dismantled, and the world exhaled. Sare. In the end, no shots were fired. Yet the Cuban Missile Crisis left a deep mark. It showed how quickly the Cold War could turn from a political contest into a deadly gamble. It also made clear the need for better communication, leading to the creation of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, so that leaders could speak within moments, rather than waiting for messages to be sent and translated. For those who lived through it, those 13 days were unforgettable. They were proof that the Cold War's quiet could shatter, and that in the silence between words, the fate of millions could hang in the balance. The Cold War was often fought in the shadows, through spies, speeches, and quiet maneuvering. But in Southeast Asia, the rivalry turned into something more visible, more costly, and far harder to control. Vietnam became one of its longest and most painful chapters. For the United States, the conflict began with a belief in a theory, the domino effect. If one country in Asia fell to communism, they feared, others would follow. For the Soviet Union and China, supporting North Vietnam was a way to spread their influence and challenge the West without fighting the United States directly. At first, American involvement was small: advisors, training, equipment. But year by year, the commitment grew, and by the mid-1960s, tens of thousands of U.S. troops were fighting in the dense jungles and muddy rice paddies of Vietnam. Helicopters thumped over the treetops, carrying soldiers into battle or lifting the wounded to safety. The Viet Cong, and the North Vietnamese army that supported them, fought with determination and skill. They used the thick forest as cover, moving through tunnels and hidden paths. For them, the war was not just about politics, it was about uniting their country under one government. Back in the United States, the war was watched every night on television. Grainy footage showed soldiers trudging through rain-soaked fields, explosions lighting up distant hills, and body counts read aloud by news anchors. At first, many supported the fight. But as the years dragged on and the casualties mounted, opposition grew. College campuses became centers of protest, and marches filled the streets of Washington, New York, and other cities. For the soldiers, the war was a grind of uncertainty. Days could pass in silence, followed by sudden bursts of gunfire. The enemy was often invisible until the moment of attack. The heat was relentless, the terrain unforgiving, and the fear constant. In Moscow, the war was watched from afar. Soviet weapons and supplies flowed into North Vietnam, but the Soviets avoided direct combat. The conflict served their purposes: it tied down American resources, strained public opinion, and showed that the West could be challenged outside Europe. By the early 1970s, the American public's patience had worn thin. The war seemed endless, and victory elusive. In 1973, U.S. combat troops withdrew, and 2 years later, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. The image of helicopters lifting desperate evacuees from the U.S. Embassy rooftop became one of the most enduring pictures of the Cold War. Vietnam left scars, on the land, on the people, and on the politics of both East and West. For the United States, it was a lesson in the limits of power. For the Soviet Union, it was proof that determined resistance could wear down even a superpower. For those who fought and lived through it, it was something far more personal, a memory of loss, sacrifice, and the heavy cost of a war fought in the name of an idea. While battles raged in far-off lands, another war unfolded in quieter places, in hotel rooms, on park benches, in the coded pages of dead-drop messages. This was the Cold War's hidden theater, where men and women lived double lives, and a single whispered word could shift the balance between East and West. Espionage had always existed, but during the Cold War, it became an art form. The Central Intelligence Agency in the United States and the KGB in the Soviet Union were locked in a constant duel. Both sought secrets, military plans, scientific breakthroughs, political intentions. Both recruited agents in embassies, universities, and factories. Sometimes, a spy looked exactly as you might imagine, a man in a trench coat, slipping into the fog. But more often, they looked like anyone else, a diplomat attending a reception, a secretary typing reports, a student in a foreign city. That was the essence of espionage, blending in so well that no one suspected the truth. In Washington, Soviet agents passed classified documents to handlers under the cover of night. In Moscow, Western spies risked everything to gather information, knowing that discovery meant prison, or worse. Safe houses became places of tense conversation, where every sound from outside might mean the game was over. Technology played its part, too. Tiny cameras hid inside cigarette cases. Listening devices were planted in walls, furniture, even gifts. Some were discovered years later, like the famous Great Seal plaque given to the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, which concealed a bug inside its carved wood. Espionage was not just about stealing secrets, it was about reading intentions. Analysts pored over intercepted communications, searching for meaning between the lines. Double agents fed false information to mislead the enemy. Entire operations unraveled when a single agent switched sides. For the spies themselves, the work was a mixture of excitement and constant strain. Friendships could never be entirely trusted. Conversations were measured, emotions kept hidden. Every meeting, every handoff, was a calculation of risk. Some became legends, names like Oleg Penkovsky, who passed Soviet missile data to the West, or Aldrich Ames, whose betrayal to the KGB cost the lives of American operatives. But for most, their stories remained untold, sealed away in classified files that might never see daylight. Espionage was the Cold War's silent heartbeat, pulsing beneath the public events and political speeches. It was a world without fanfare, where victories were uncelebrated and failures could never be admitted. In its shadows, the Cold War was fought day after day, by people whose faces the public would never know. By the middle years of the Cold War, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had taken on a dangerous, almost surreal dimension. Both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over. And yet, instead of making war inevitable, this terrifying power seemed to hold it at bay, a strange, fragile peace built on the certainty of mutual destruction. This was the logic of deterrence, known by a grim acronym, MAD, mutually assured destruction. The idea was simple but chilling: if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would respond with equal or greater force, ensuring that both would be obliterated. In this way, the very weapons that could end civilization were meant to protect it. The arms race was relentless. First came the atomic bomb, then the far more powerful hydrogen bomb. Missiles grew faster, more accurate, able to reach targets across the globe in minutes. Submarines, silent beneath the seas, carried warheads that could be launched from anywhere. Bombers stayed in the air around the clock, ready to strike if an order ever came. Each advance by one side pushed the other to respond. When the U.S. developed multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, missiles that could carry several warheads, the Soviets built their own. When one side built anti-missile defenses, the other designed weapons to evade them. It was an endless cycle, each step forward matched by another. For ordinary people, the arms race was a source of constant unease. Schools held duck and cover drills, teaching children to hide under desks in case of attack. Civil defense pamphlets explained how to build fallout shelters and stock them with food and water. In some neighborhoods, families actually dug them into their backyards, small underground rooms meant to survive a blast that might never come. But for the scientists and engineers on both sides, the work was a mixture of pride and dread. They were building machines of astonishing complexity, and unimaginable destruction. Many wrestled with the knowledge that their creations could end life on Earth, yet believed that failing to keep pace with the other side would be even more dangerous. In the end, the nuclear balance was a kind of high-stakes standoff. No one could win a nuclear war, and both sides knew it. This awareness, paradoxically, became a form of stability. The fear of destruction was so great that it kept leaders from crossing the final line. Still, accidents happened. False alarms, computer errors, and misunderstood signals came perilously close to triggering catastrophe. The fact that such moments passed without disaster was due as much to human judgment, and sometimes sheer luck, as to strategy or planning. The Cold War's nuclear shadow was long and dark. It hung over every decision, every crisis, every handshake between leaders. It was a reminder that in this strange, dangerous era, peace was not the absence of threat, but the constant presence of one too terrible to unleash. The Cold War was not only fought on Earth. It reached upward, beyond the clouds, into the black expanse of space. Here, too, the United States and the Soviet Union competed, not for territory in the traditional sense, but for prestige, technology, and the symbolic high ground of the heavens. It began with a single metallic sphere. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. It was no larger than a beach ball, but its steady radio beeps as it circled the globe sent shockwaves through the world. For the first time, humanity had placed a machine in orbit, and it was the Soviets who had done it first. In Washington, the news landed with urgency. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch missiles across continents. The space race had begun, fueled by both wonder and fear. Soon after, the Soviets sent Laika, a small dog, into orbit aboard Sputnik 2. The United States responded with its own satellites, and then with Explorer 1, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belts around Earth. Each success was trumpeted as proof of national superiority, each failure hidden or downplayed. The rivalry reached new heights in 1961, when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. His single orbit of Earth was celebrated across the Soviet Union and admired, albeit grudgingly, in the West. The U.S. answered with Alan Shepard and then John Glenn, who orbited the Earth 3 times in 1962. But America's ambitions were set even higher. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy declared the goal of landing a man on the moon before the decade's end. It was a challenge not just to explore space, but to prove American technological and organizational might. The race accelerated. Rockets grew larger and more powerful, the Soviet N-1, the American Saturn V. Each mission carried not only astronauts or cosmonauts, but also the hopes of millions and the pride of nations. In July 1969, the U.S. achieved its goal. Apollo 11 carried Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon, where Armstrong's words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," were broadcast to every corner of the Earth. The Soviet Union never matched a manned lunar landing, but continued to excel in other areas, long-duration spaceflight, space stations, and robotic exploration. For all its political undertones, the space race also inspired cooperation. Even at the height of rivalry, scientists from both sides occasionally shared data. By the 1970s, tensions eased enough for the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit, their crews shaking hands in weightlessness. Space had become a new arena for human ambition, and a reminder that even in an age of suspicion, shared curiosity could bridge divides. The Cold War might have placed them in competition, but it also pushed humanity to look up, to reach further, and to dream beyond the blue sky. In the winter of 1968, the heart of Europe beat with cautious hope. In Czechoslovakia, a new leader had risen, Alexander Dubček, a man who spoke of reforms, openness, and a socialism with a human face. For years, the nation had lived under a rigid communist system, tightly aligned with Moscow. Now, it seemed, change might be possible. The movement came to be known as the Prague Spring. Censorship was eased, political discussion flourished, and students debated openly in cafes. Newspapers published opinions without fear. People gathered in public squares, not to protest, but simply to enjoy the feeling of freedom, fragile, unexpected, and intoxicating. Dubček's reforms were not a rejection of socialism, but an attempt to make it more responsive, more humane. He envisioned a society where people could speak their minds, travel more freely, and participate in decision-making, all while maintaining the economic and political structure of the Eastern Bloc. But in Moscow, the changes were viewed with suspicion and alarm. The Soviet leadership feared that Czechoslovakia's openness would spread to other countries in the Warsaw Pact, weakening the unity they believed was essential for security. Through the spring and summer, the tension grew. Soviet and other Warsaw Pact troops conducted exercises near Czechoslovakia's borders. Negotiations took place, but trust was thin. The people of Prague continued to meet, talk, and dream, even as the shadow of intervention lengthened. Then, in the early hours of August 21, 1968, the hope was shattered. More than 200,000 troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria crossed the borders. Tanks rolled through the streets of Prague. The air was filled with the rumble of engines and the disbelief of a people who had hoped for change without bloodshed. There was resistance, but it was largely non-violent. Citizens confronted soldiers with words, not weapons, trying to explain that no one had called for their help. Signs appeared in multiple languages, urging the troops to go home. Radio stations broadcast until they were silenced. Dubček and other leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow. Though he returned to office briefly, his power was gone, and the reforms were rolled back. The era of normalization began, a return to the strict controls that had defined life before the spring. Yet the Prague Spring was not entirely lost. For those who lived it, it was proof that even under a heavy system, the human desire for freedom and dignity could surface. And for those beyond Czechoslovakia's borders, it was a reminder that the Cold War was not only about the superpowers, it was also about the smaller nations caught between them, and the dreams they dared to dream. By the early 1970s, after decades of suspicion, arms races, and proxy wars, the superpowers began to step back from the edge. The name for this tentative easing of tensions was détente, a French word meaning release from tension. It was not friendship, nor even full trust, but rather a recognition that the costs of perpetual hostility were too high for both sides to bear. Several forces pushed the United States and the Soviet Union toward this cautious thaw. The long, draining conflict in Vietnam had made Americans weary of endless confrontation. The Soviets, for their part, faced economic strains and the challenge of keeping pace with U.S. technology. Both nations knew that an unchecked arms race could bankrupt them, or worse, lead to accidental catastrophe. Détente found its first expression in diplomacy. In 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon traveled to Moscow, the first American leader to do so since World War II. He met with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, a stern, pragmatic figure who understood both the limits of Soviet power and the dangers of confrontation. The two leaders signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-I, placing caps on certain categories of nuclear weapons. While far from disarmament, it was a milestone, the first formal agreement to restrain the arms race rather than fuel it. Trade also expanded. Grain deals brought American wheat to Soviet markets, while scientific and cultural exchanges gave citizens on both sides rare glimpses into the other's world. American films played in Moscow theaters, Soviet ballet toured New York and Paris. Détente was not limited to U.S.-Soviet relations. It was part of a broader shift in the Cold War. West Germany, under Chancellor Willy Brandt, pursued Ostpolitik, a policy of reconciliation with Eastern Europe. In 1975, more than 30 nations signed the Helsinki Accords, agreeing to respect borders and human rights. Though the agreements were non-binding, they offered a framework for dialogue that would echo in later years. Still, détente was fragile. Beneath the surface, mistrust remained. The Soviet Union continued to build up its military, the United States maintained global alliances aimed at containing communism. When local conflicts erupted, in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, the superpowers often backed opposing sides. By the late 1970s, cracks were showing. Critics in the United States accused the Soviets of exploiting détente to strengthen their position while giving little in return. In Moscow, hardliners worried that too much openness would weaken socialist discipline. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 would mark the effective end of the détente era. Yet for a brief time, the Cold War's ice had thinned. Leaders had spoken across the divide, agreements had been signed, and for a moment, it seemed possible that the confrontation could be managed without always living in the shadow of disaster. Détente had not ended the Cold War, but it had shown that even in an age of rivalry, there was room for dialogue. The 1980s brought a return of cold winds across the global stage. After the cautious thaw of détente, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union once again sharpened, ushering in what many called the Second Cold War. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan took a firm stance against the Soviet Union, calling it the evil empire, and ramping up military spending. The United States invested heavily in new weapons systems, including the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, which aimed to create a missile defense shield. Moscow, led by General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev until his death in 1982, and then by Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, responded with its own military buildup and intensified rhetoric. The Soviets increased support for proxy conflicts around the world, including in Afghanistan, where their troops had been engaged since 1979. The renewed hostility was reflected in culture and diplomacy alike. Olympic boycotts in 1980 and 1984 underscored the division. Propaganda campaigns escalated, and the world seemed once more poised on the edge of confrontation. Yet beneath the surface of rivalry, changes were stirring. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union, bringing with him new ideas and a willingness to reform. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sought to revitalize the Soviet system but also introduced greater transparency and dialogue. Over the next few years, Gorbachev and Reagan engaged in a series of summits that gradually eased tensions. Agreements on nuclear arms reduction, such as the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, marked significant progress. The Second Cold War was a time of contrasts, fierce competition and cautious cooperation, harsh words and hopeful gestures. For many around the world, it was a period of uncertainty, wondering if the world would spiral back into conflict or find a path toward peace. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall stood as a stark symbol of division, a concrete barrier that split a city, a country, and the world itself. It was a physical reminder of the Cold War's most visible line, separating East from West, freedom from control. Built in 1961, the wall was meant to stop the flow of people fleeing East Germany for the West. It stretched over 96 miles, guarded by watchtowers, barbed wire, and armed soldiers. Families were torn apart overnight. Streets that once connected neighbors now ended abruptly at the barrier. But by the late 1980s, winds of change were blowing across Eastern Europe. Economic troubles, popular protests, and new political leadership challenged the old order. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms encouraged openness, and the Kremlin signaled it would no longer use force to prop up failing regimes. In East Germany, citizens began to demand reform. Crowds gathered in cities like Leipzig, holding peaceful demonstrations that grew week after week. The government tried to resist, but the momentum was unstoppable. On November 9, 1989, a misunderstanding at a press conference led to the announcement that East Germans could cross the border immediately. Thousands rushed to the wall, overwhelming guards who, unprepared and unsure, opened the gates. People climbed atop the wall, chipping away at the concrete with hammers and chisels, celebrating with cheers, tears, and songs. For many, it was a moment of joy and disbelief. The physical barrier that had divided families and countries was beginning to crumble. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not the end of the Cold War by itself, but it was the beginning of its final chapter. It symbolized the failure of the old system and the power of people's desire for freedom and unity. In the months that followed, East and West Germany moved toward reunification, formally becoming one country again in 1990. Across Eastern Europe, similar changes unfolded, governments fell, borders opened, and the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for decades began to lift. The wall's fall was quiet in the sense that it happened without the violence many had feared. It was a testament to peaceful change, a gentle tearing down of barriers built not just of concrete, but of fear and mistrust. The years following the fall of the Berlin Wall were marked by rapid and profound change. The Soviet Union, long the centerpiece of the Cold War, was itself unraveling, caught between the weight of its history and the pressures of a new era. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened the door to change but also unleashed forces that the government struggled to control. Glasnost, or openness, allowed people to speak more freely, exposing long-hidden problems and frustrations. Perestroika, the restructuring of the economy and government, aimed to modernize a system that was increasingly failing. Yet these reforms could not stop the tide of nationalist movements rising across the Soviet republics. In places like the Baltic states, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, calls for independence grew louder. Citizens organized protests, declared sovereignty, and demanded the right to govern themselves. The old Communist Party's grip weakened. In August 1991, a failed coup attempt by hardline members tried to reverse Gorbachev's policies but only hastened the collapse. Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a key figure opposing the coup, symbolizing the shift toward a new Russia. By December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged, with Russia as the largest successor state. The Cold War, which had shaped global politics for nearly half a century, was finally over. The end of the Soviet Union brought hope for many, a chance for democracy, openness, and peace. But it also brought uncertainty. Economies struggled, old conflicts flared, and the world adjusted to a new balance of power. For those who had lived through the Cold War's long shadow, the moment was both an ending and a beginning. The ideologies that had divided nations seemed to fade, replaced by new challenges and opportunities. The Cold War's conclusion was quiet, without fanfare or final battles. Instead, it was a slow, complex unraveling, a reminder that even the most powerful systems can change, sometimes in unexpected ways. The Cold War was over, but its echoes still lingered, in the memories of those who lived it, in the politics of the world, and in the lessons it left behind. For nearly half a century, the world had been divided by fear and ideology, by walls and weapons, by whispered secrets and public speeches. Yet, amid the tension, humanity had also found moments of hope, in peaceful protests, cultural exchanges, and even the quiet courage of individuals who dreamed of a better future. The Cold War shaped a generation, teaching the costs of division and the power of diplomacy. It reminded the world that strength could come not only from armies, but from dialogue and understanding. Today, the barriers it built may be gone, but the need to listen, to bridge divides, remains. The stories of the past encourage us to remember how easily fear can lead to conflict, and how vital it is to seek peace. In quiet moments, when the noise of the world fades, the Cold War's reflections remind us that history is not just about leaders and battles, but about the everyday lives touched by distant struggles. As we look back, we carry forward a hope that future generations will find ways to resolve their differences not with weapons or walls, but with words, respect, and a shared desire for a peaceful world. The Cold War was a long, complex story. Now, as night falls and the world grows still, its quiet reflections invite us to listen, learn, and remember.